Edward Kane had once been a man whose very name carried weight in the fast-moving corridors of Silicon Valley. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, when technology was still finding its way from the dreams of hobbyists into the bloodstream of the global economy, Edward had stood at the center of it all. He was not a charismatic CEO, not the polished face of a billion-dollar startup, but the man in the background, the one whose mind seemed to hold the logic of entire systems. To his colleagues, Edward was a quiet storm. He did not waste words in meetings, but when he finally spoke, what he offered was precise, brilliant, and often years ahead of its time. His specialty was data preservation and recovery, software that could restore what was thought irretrievably lost. Universities, banks, even government offices eventually relied on the backbone of the systems he had written. He had the kind of career that young engineers whispered about in cafeterias. One day, maybe I'll write code like Edward Kane. At home, life was just as full. He had married young, Elizabeth, a school teacher with a laugh that seemed to lift him out of the intensity of his work. They had a daughter, Anna, who loved to sit beside him late at night, watching the glow of his computer screen. She didn't understand the code scrolling past, but she loved the way her father's eyes lit up when he explained it to her. "You see this line?" he told her once, pointing to a string of characters. "This is like a safety net. If the system crashes, this little piece of code makes sure everything is caught so nothing falls forever." Anna, no older than 10 at the time, nodded seriously, though she hardly understood. Still, she repeated the phrase back to him, safety net, as though it were a magic word. Edward believed, then, that he had built a life as unshakable as his systems. But life, unlike code, does not wait for commands to execute. The night everything changed. It happened in an instant, though the echoes lasted forever. Elizabeth had been driving home late from a faculty meeting one winter evening. The roads were slick with rain that had turned to thin, treacherous sheets of ice. Edward had been at his desk, preparing to show her a new project he was excited about, a self-healing recovery module that he believed could change the industry. The phone rang. The details were a blur. A drunk driver, a head-on collision. The words instant and nothing anyone could have done. Edward remembered dropping the phone, his hands numb, his throat unable to form sound. Anna, just 14 then, stood frozen in the hallway, her eyes wide as the silence told her everything. In the weeks that followed, Edward moved through the world as though underwater. He returned to work quickly, but the once precise lines of code blurred before him. Mistakes slipped in. Deadlines fell behind. His colleagues, sympathetic at first, grew impatient. The industry was merciless. If you could not keep pace, it left you behind. At home, the silence of Elizabeth's absence gnawed at him. He tried to connect with Anna, but grief had carved a canyon between them. Where once she had sat beside him in wonder, now she avoided the sight of his screen, avoided the house itself, spending more time at friends' places. Edward, unable to bear the empty rooms, turned instead to the bottle. Whiskey dulled the ache, at least for a while. The spiral was slow at first, then sudden. Within 2 years, Edward's projects had slipped from groundbreaking to irrelevant. New engineers, younger and hungrier, replaced him. By the time he looked up, the industry he had once shaped no longer had a place for him. The slow unraveling. The years stretched out in a cruel rhythm. His savings dwindled, his network of colleagues evaporated. He tried freelancing, tried consulting, but the field had raced ahead without him. The younger generation spoke a new language of frameworks and tools he hadn't mastered, and he, once the teacher, now found himself struggling to keep up. By the time Anna went off to college, their relationship was already fractured. He had missed too many recitals, too many chances to simply sit at the table and ask how she was. She left with a hug that felt like goodbye, and soon calls became rare. then stopped altogether. Edward's home, once filled with books and warmth, became cluttered with unpaid bills and empty bottles. He sold furniture, then electronics, then the car. When the house was finally foreclosed, he left with nothing but a duffel bag and an old laptop that no longer worked. The streets were colder than he imagined. Pride kept him from reaching out for help. Pride and shame intertwined. Shelters became his temporary refuge, but he hated the pity in people's eyes. What he craved was not sympathy, but respect, something he had not felt in years. And yet, there was one place that still welcomed him: the library. The refuge of paper and silence. It was not grand, just a city library with creaking wooden floors, fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly, and shelves that stretched like quiet soldiers in endless rows. But to Edward, it became a sanctuary. He could sit at a corner table without being questioned. He could read without spending a dime. He could pretend, even for an hour, that he was still part of the world. He came daily, carrying the broken laptop in his bag as though it gave him purpose. Some days, he read technical manuals, trying to keep his mind sharp. Other days, he lost himself in novels, in histories, in anything that reminded him that human lives had always carried both tragedy and resilience. To the staff, he was the vagabond, a homeless man who lingered too long, sometimes dozing off, sometimes muttering to himself about lines of code no one understood. Students avoided his table. Parents pulled their children away from him. Few ever asked his name. Edward accepted the anonymity. Invisibility was easier than explaining who he had been. But in the quiet hours, when the library emptied and the hum of the servers echoed faintly from the basement, Edward would sit back, close his eyes, and remember. He remembered Elizabeth's laugh, Anna's small voice asking about the safety net, and the way his fingers once danced across keyboards, writing programs that mattered. Foreshadow of what's to come. Life seemed destined to fade into this gray routine, days in the library, nights on the street. But fate, which had once stolen everything from him in a single moment, was about to turn again. For hidden deep within the library's servers was a system Edward himself had once built. It had been years since he touched its code, but it bore his logic, his fingerprints. And soon, when crisis struck and the city's archives threatened to vanish, it would be Edward, the vagabond no one respected, who held the only key. The library had always been Edward Kane's refuge, a place where time moved slowly, measured by the turning of pages rather than the ticking of clocks. That Tuesday began like so many others. He had arrived early, before the afternoon crowd of students and office workers seeking quiet corners. The faint aroma of coffee drifted from the lobby, mixing with the smell of ink and dust. Edward found his usual seat near the back, a table tucked between the computer lab and the towering history shelves. He opened a worn paperback, not because he was reading, but because it allowed him to sit without drawing suspicion. His eyes drifted instead to the hum of the servers beneath the floorboards. He could feel them, almost hear their heartbeat, like a distant reminder of the world he once commanded. The morning passed uneventfully. Patrons whispered, children giggled in the reading room, and the overhead lights flickered in their usual weary rhythm. Nothing foretold the storm that was about to arrive. The first signs of collapse. It began with a flicker. At first, no one paid attention. Computer screens in the main lab blinked, then steadied. A second later, another flicker. "Ugh, not again," a young clerk muttered, tapping his keyboard. "These old systems crash all the time." Edward's ears pricked up. He looked across the room. The flicker wasn't random. It had a pattern. To him, it was the digital equivalent of a heartbeat stuttering. Then it came. One by one, the monitors across the library went black. For a split second, the room was filled with the reflected glow of nothingness. Then, lines of code erupted, garbled, corrupted, spreading across the screens like ink in water. What the hell? A student gasped, pulling off his headphones. The alarm system kicked in, shrill and piercing. Red lights flashed along the ceiling, bathing the shelves in a sinister glow. People stood up, startled. The quiet hum of the library dissolved into chaos. From the front desk, the head librarian's voice cracked through the noise. "Attention! Everyone stay calm. We're experiencing a technical issue." But her eyes betrayed panic. Edward recognized it immediately. The kind of fear you feel when you know the problem is beyond your reach, the desperate scramble. Technicians were called in from the back office. Young staff crowded around the main console, their fingers hammering keyboards, their voices sharp with urgency. "It's locked us out!" one shouted. "Try the backup drive!" another barked. "No response. It's corrupted, too." Edward rose slightly from his chair, pretending to stretch, but really to listen. He caught glimpses of the screens, sectors collapsing, error messages layering over one another. The system was not just failing, it was eating itself alive. The head librarian's voice rose above the clamor. "If we lose this database, the city loses decades of archives, newspapers, legal records, genealogies, research projects, all of it." A murmur spread through the patrons. Students cursed, fearing lost theses. Local historians panicked over endangered records. Parents tried to calm their children as the alarms wailed. Through it all, Edward stood at the edge, unseen, unwanted. Yet his mind was sharper than it had been in years. He could see the pathways of the crash as though the code itself whispered to him. This wasn't just a random failure. It was a cascading corruption triggered by an overlooked vulnerability. And he knew the fix. The moment of hesitation. For the first time in years, Edward felt his pulse race with clarity. He wanted to step forward, to walk to the console and take command. His hands itched for a keyboard, but fear anchored him. Would they even let him near it? To them, he was just a vagabond, a man in a ragged coat who smelled faintly of the streets. If he stood up, they might laugh. Worse, they might call security. Still, as the panic grew, as the young clerk slammed his fist against the desk and shouted, "We can't stop it!" Edward realized he had no choice. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. The ridicule. "May I try?" The words came out steady, quiet, but they cut through the noise. Heads turned. The staff stared. One clerk frowned. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're handling this." "You don't understand," Edward pressed, his voice firmer now. "That system, you're fighting against it wrong. You need to bypass the corrupted sectors before the loop completes, or it'll lock you out permanently." The young technician scoffed. "And you know this? How? Because you read a book about computers?" A ripple of laughter followed. The librarian, frazzled and desperate, waved a dismissive hand. "Please, sir, step aside." Edward's jaw tightened. He had expected this. He had lived years under these looks, mockery, dismissal, pity. But something inside him, something long buried, refused to sit back down. He stepped closer to the console. "I know this because I wrote it." The room fell into uneasy silence. The command line awakens. Before anyone could stop him, Edward sat down at the console. His fingers, though weathered, moved with startling precision. The familiar hum of the keyboard was like an old song. "Root access," he murmured, typing commands that flowed from memory. Green text cascaded down the screen. Commands opened gateways the younger technicians didn't even know existed. He bypassed the corrupted modules, rerouted the recovery scripts, and manually patched vulnerabilities. Each keystroke was a strike against the spreading failure. The staff stood frozen, eyes wide. One whispered, "I've never even seen those commands before." Within minutes, the black screens blinked back to life. The error messages vanished, replaced by steady, glowing interfaces. The archives reappeared, whole and intact. The alarms fell silent. The red lights dimmed. The library exhaled as though the building itself had been saved. Shock and reverence. Applause erupted spontaneously. Patrons clapped. Some shouted in relief. Students who had sneered at him now stared in awe. The young technician shook his head, muttering, "That shouldn't have been possible. He just reversed a full cascade failure." The librarian approached slowly, almost reverently. "Sir, what did you say your name was?" Edward leaned back in the chair. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of his identity return. He met her eyes and said simply, "Edward Kane. I built this system a long time ago." The words rippled through the room like thunder. The whisper of redemption. In that moment, Edward was no longer invisible. He was no longer the vagabond who haunted the library's corners. He was once again the engineer, the architect, the man whose code had safeguarded the city's history. And though he did not know it yet, this single act would not just restore the archives, it would restore something far more fragile: his place in the world, and the bridge back to the daughter who still carried his name. The silence after the applause was almost louder than the chaos had been. Edward Kane remained seated at the console, his weathered hands still resting on the keys, as though his fingers themselves could not believe what they had just done. The glow of the screen lit his face, casting deep shadows across the lines carved by years of hardship. For a moment, he looked not like a vagabond, not like a man beaten by life, but like what he truly was, a master who had tamed a storm. The staff circled around him, still dazed. One technician whispered, "I've studied recovery protocols my whole career. I've never even seen commands like those." Another, who had dismissed him minutes earlier, now lowered his head, ashamed. The head librarian finally found her voice. "Mr. Kane," she began, the name trembling in her mouth like an unfamiliar relic. "I don't know how to thank you. You saved the archives. You saved all of this." Edward's lips curved into the faintest smile. He didn't bask in the praise, didn't gloat. He simply nodded, as though what he had done was as natural as breathing. Inside, though, something long dormant stirred. For years he had walked through life unseen, unacknowledged. Now, for the first time, people looked at him with eyes that did not pity or fear, but respected. The news spreads. By evening, the story had already slipped beyond the library walls. Word of the mystery vagabond who saved the city's archives reached local reporters. The narrative was irresistible. A forgotten drifter in a torn coat had done what a team of young professionals could not. The next morning, headlines carried his name again. Edward Kane, once renowned software engineer, reemerges in unlikely rescue. Photographs showed him at the console, hunched but steady, eyes alive with purpose. For Edward, the attention was dizzying. Strangers stopped him in the street, offering handshakes, coffee, sometimes even money. A local cafe owner pressed a warm meal into his hands, saying softly, "On the house, sir. Thank you." For years he had been invisible. Now he could hardly take a step without recognition. Yet fame was never what Edward sought. What mattered to him was something smaller, quieter, something that still ached like an unhealed wound. His daughter. The ghost of Anna. Every headline, every news clip carried his name. And he wondered if, somewhere out there, Anna had seen them. Did she still think of him? Or had she erased him long ago, the way one deletes a corrupted file? He remembered her as a teenager standing in the hallway the night Elizabeth died, her face pale with shock. He remembered the anger in her eyes years later, when he had stumbled home drunk instead of attending her school recital. He remembered the silence that grew between them, like a canyon widening day by day until it was unbridgeable. It was the silence that haunted him most. Now, sitting once more in his corner of the library, Edward turned these memories over like sharp stones in his hand. He had restored a city's memory, but could he restore his daughter's faith in him? The unexpected reunion. It happened sooner than he dared imagine. 3 days after the incident, Edward was seated near the window, leafing absent-mindedly through a newspaper he hadn't paid for, when the librarian approached. "Mr. Kane," she said gently, "there's someone here to see you." He looked up, expecting perhaps a reporter or a curious stranger. Instead, standing just beyond her shoulder, was a woman in her 30s with chestnut hair tied back, eyes the color of his own. She held a framed photograph clutched to her chest. "Dad," she whispered. The world seemed to collapse into that single word. Edward rose slowly, his breath caught in his throat. "Anna." For a moment, neither moved. The years stretched between them, years of distance, resentment, and silence. But then, as though something inside her broke free, Anna stepped forward and embraced him. The photograph slipped from her hands and clattered to the floor, but neither noticed. Edward's arms wrapped around her, trembling. Tears he had buried for decades spilled down his cheeks. "I thought I'd lost you," he choked. "You almost did," she murmured against his shoulder. "But then I saw you on the news, and I thought maybe the man I knew wasn't gone after all." The conversation they never had. They sat together for hours in the library cafe, cups of untouched coffee cooling before them. Words came haltingly at first, then in floods. Edward told her everything, the grief that had consumed him after Elizabeth's death, the way he had failed her, the shame that kept him from reaching out. Anna, in turn, confessed her own pain, how she had felt abandoned, how she had hated him for choosing the bottle over her, how she had convinced herself it was easier to forget than to keep hoping. There were no easy answers, no perfect apologies, but there was honesty, and there was listening. And for the first time in decades, father and daughter spoke not as strangers, but as two wounded souls trying to find their way back to each other. When they parted that evening, Anna pressed the framed photograph into his hands. It was a picture of the three of them, Edward, Elizabeth, and a much younger Anna, smiling in a sunlit park. "Keep it," she said softly. "Maybe we can start again." The quiet redemption. Life did not transform overnight. Edward did not suddenly regain his lost career or reclaim the years the streets had stolen from him. He still wore the same ragged coat, still returned to the library each day. But everything felt different now. When people passed him, they nodded with respect. Students who once avoided his table now asked for help with their coding projects. The librarian saved him a seat near the window. And most importantly, Anna began visiting, sometimes for an hour, sometimes just to leave him a meal. Each time, the silence between them grew smaller. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Edward sat alone with the photograph. He traced Elizabeth's smile with his finger, then looked at Anna's young face in the picture. He whispered, "I couldn't save your mother, but maybe I can save us." And for the first time in years, he believed it. The final scene. Weeks later, Edward returned to the console one last time, not to rescue a failing system, but to help the staff upgrade the recovery protocols. He trained them patiently, answering questions, explaining the logic behind his designs. They listened intently, scribbling notes, eager to learn from the man they once dismissed. When he finished, the head librarian shook his hand firmly. "You'll always have a place here, Mr. Kane, not just as a patron, as part of this library's story." Edward nodded, gratitude swelling in his chest. But he knew the truest place he had regained was not in a library or in headlines. It was in his daughter's life. That evening, Anna met him outside. She slipped her arm through his as they walked toward the bus stop. The city lights glowed softly around them. "Dad," she said, smiling faintly, "you once told me about a safety net in your code. Remember? How it caught everything before it could fall forever?" Edward's throat tightened. "Yes, I remember." Anna squeezed his arm. "Maybe you built one for us too." He looked at her, his eyes wet with tears he no longer felt ashamed to shed. "Maybe we'll build it together." And so, under the quiet hum of the city, Edward Kane, the vagabond, the forgotten genius, the father who had stumbled and fallen, walked forward into a life not fully healed, but no longer broken.